Civil rights. White America had to realize, when Martin Luther King said it best, that no other ethnic group had ever been a slave on American soil. And it was because color was the problem that could not be overlooked. That color of skin was the reason why blacks were slaves to whites in a pre-Civil War America. And that a post-Civil War America had to change things. But it was not changed. 100 years after the Civil War, freedom was still a dream. Though Reconstruction was supposed to fix the idea that Africans and African Americans were freed from slavery and that would be given equal rights to whites through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, respectively, in 1865, 1866, and 1870. But what they didn't do was enforce these laws. White governments all along the South, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, they refused to acknowledge that the Civil War had changed things. The United States had not had a president strong enough that had changed things. Sure, the military was desegregated in the 1940s. Sure, Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, the first African American to visit the White House. Sure, the laws were changing, but no one was enforcing them. Blacks went to different schools, drank from different water fountains, ate at different food counters. Few of them dared to cross the color lines of integration. Few of them dared to sit in white-only sections, to sit in movie theaters next to whites, to order from white lunch counters in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. Jim Crow had owned the South. Even after World War II, in the mid-1950s, after segregated troops, blacks came home to oppression in the Deep South. They still rode on the back of buses, ate lunch at different lunch counters, drank from different water fountains, saw movies in different sections, went to the store in different areas, after they had literally seen racial and religious oppression in Europe, after they fought next to whites, next to Mexican Americans, next to Jews, next to everyone, seeing that they were fighting social oppression. And yet what they were fighting for in Europe was not happening in their home country of the United States. This all would change. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks went on a bus in Selma, Alabama, and refused to give up her seat on a public bus to make room for a white passenger. She was the secretary of the Montgomery NAACP chapter, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a peaceful, nonviolent political group that fought to advocate for blacks' civil rights. She had returned from a meeting in Tennessee where they discussed nonviolent protests, and she then took it upon herself to sit on that bus and to refuse getting up for a white woman. She was arrested, tried, and convicted for quote-unquote. When Rosa Parks' story got out, 50 African-American leaders, including a very young 26-year-old reverend born on Sweet Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Martin Luther King, then went to Montgomery and decided to boycott the bus transportation system. And when a majority of your customers are black and blacks boycott your transportation system, things will not look so good. You will lose money. You will lose passengers. You will lose popularity. And most of all, you will make news and it will not be positive. After these boycotts and other reforms, 50,000 Americans living in the Montgomery area boycotted for 381 days until finally the court system in Alabama lifted the local ordinance of segregation, reversing the segregation law on the buses because the public transportation system could not financially support itself without its black customers. 90% of African Americans partook in these boycotts, which reduced the bus revenue approximately 80% of what it was originally making. In November 1956, after the court decided to lift the segregation appeals, the boycott ended, and Rosa Parks became one of the most famous persons of the civil rights movement. She was known as the mother of the civil rights movement. Another person would become the father of the civil rights movement, that person being Dr. Martin Luther King. He was the new kid on the block, you would say. He was a spokesperson. He was thrown into the positions in Selma and in Montgomery and in Atlanta and in North Carolina and in Louisiana. He was thrown into those leadership positions. He said, the longer you sit in the back and the longer they sit in the front, the longer this will go on. The longer we allow blacks to sit back and watch whites write these laws and run these businesses and dictate our lives, the longer this will go on and the worse off it will be for us. African Americans fought to end racial discrimination through litigation, laws, education, lobbying, boycotting. The most widely known of these protests and these court cases came in 1954 when the Supreme Court decided to hear the Brown versus Board of Education court case. The Brown versus Board of Education case was the landmark case to end segregation. In this case, a young girl in Topeka, Kansas had to walk 9 miles to school to get to her black elementary school when she walked by a white public school merely a couple miles after her house. They brought this to the court's attention, and finally, in a 9-0 vote, the Supreme Court overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson idea of quote-unquote separate but equal. That as long as blacks had separate facilities and they were getting the same amount or treatment and it was equal to their white counterparts, then it was fine. As long as blacks rode on rail cars that were separate from whites, as long as they got to the end destination they needed to get to, that was okay. If blacks sat at a different lunch counter, as long as they got the same food that whites got, that was okay. No longer was this an option. Finally, the law stated in 1954, the Supreme Court said segregation is unconstitutional and that they would integrate with deliberate speed. Think about it. Deliberate speed. Does that mean they're going fast? No. You can't do that. You can't magically write a law that says all of a sudden everything that was desegregated is now integrated. Because that's millions of dollars of taking down signs, of fixing up sections in restaurants, movie theaters, buses, rail cars, etc. That's millions of dollars that needs to be funded into the public school systems to desegregate the schools, to desegregate the buses, the restaurants, everything. Millions of dollars. And the Deep South was not willing to do this. They were willing to do it with deliberate speed, but they weren't going to do it at a quick pace. They would take their time. It would take the presidencies of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1960s to really push forward America's black civil rights, to desegregate and to do it not with deliberate speed, but to do it immediately.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now is the time to make real the promise
ashes of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation, the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time. Now is the time. I have a dream. Every valley shall be exalted. I have